So one important thing when talking about PhoneGap is why PhoneGap. We really have to have a good business case for using PhoneGap because it is a platform that we're going to have to invest significant technology resources in. So there's some major arguments that I have for PhoneGap, and we'll look at some of the ones against PhoneGap. If you just need a simple application, if you're not doing something very complicated, PhoneGap is going to be able to do that for you. And if your native application feel isn't that high on your priority list, because PhoneGap applications are not going to feel completely native. If you have a large investment in HTML and JavaScript, for example, if you're using Backbone.js or a popular JavaScript framework, and most of your developers are really good JavaScript developers and are very familiar with HTML, PhoneGap is really going to be something that you're going to want to consider because you're going to be able to reuse that skill set. If you need to go to multiple devices, and when I say multiple devices, I mean iOS, Android, Windows Phone 7. If you have a long list of devices that you need to be able to support in different platforms, PhoneGap is going to be able to do that a lot better than some other choices. For example, if you chose MonoTouch and Mono for Android, although those are great frameworks, it's going to be harder to support something like Blackberry. You're not going to have that ability, but PhoneGap would give you that ability. And also, if you are considering just building an HTML5 web application versus PhoneGap, the big difference here is if you need to put your app in the App Store and you need to do a lot of offline data access or run your app offline, PhoneGap is going to work better than a web-based app in that case because you're going to be able to put that app in the App Store and sell that app if you want, and your application or the HTML is going to be loaded onto the device instead of having to request that from a web server, so your users can be disconnected and still use the application if it's PhoneGap app. Now, PhoneGap is not always going to be the solution that you want to use for every application that you're going to build. So for example, if you need a native look and feel, PhoneGap really might not be the thing that you want to choose because PhoneGap is not going to look and feel like the native API. You can get it pretty close, but a lot of users are probably going to be able to figure out that you're running inside a web browser or it's not quite right. The other thing that might prevent you from using PhoneGap is some complex UIs. If you're using a lot of the native features of the device and you have complicated user interfaces that are really going to require a lot of the native features, you're not going to be able to create the same experience with PhoneGap. If you have kind of a simple navigation, a simple flow, and you're not really getting too deep into the APIs, PhoneGap is going to work great for you. But if you're getting into that complexity, you might want to consider some alternatives. Speed is a consideration. It's not a huge consideration, but if you really need to be doing some crunching with the hardware and you really need to be down to the bare metal as far as speed and performance is concerned, PhoneGap is probably going to slow you down because you're going to be launching through a browser and you're going to be interpreting JavaScript and HTML. And then finally, if you're just going to deploy to one or two platforms, you could still use PhoneGap, but you might want to go with a platform that you already have some investment in. So if you already are an iOS developer or an Android developer, it might be just as easy to learn one more platform and port your code over there, or to use something like MonoTouch and Mono for Android together than it would be to use PhoneGap. You really have to weigh the business requirements and what your requirements are, and after this course you should have a good idea of what PhoneGap does and how you can use PhoneGap so it'll help you to make some better decisions.